The story of Sergei and Francis Arsentiev begins with the moment they met, brought together by their shared passion for the mountains. Sergei Arsentiev, a Russian mountaineer with extensive experience, had already conquered several of the world's most challenging peaks. His drive to reach the highest summits was always tied to a personal challenge and a desire to push the boundaries of what was possible. Francis, an American by birth, was also no stranger to mountaineering. She had a vibrant personality and a remarkable determination that immediately attracted Sergei. They met in the early 1990s and quickly realized that they were united not only by their love for the mountains, but also by a deep mutual understanding. Their bond was built on a shared dream: to conquer Everest, the highest peak in the world. For each of them, this challenge represented something more than just reaching a high altitude. For Sergei, it was a continuation of his sporting career, a quest for perfection, and a test of his physical and moral limits. For Francis, it symbolized her independence and strength, her ability to see things through to the end. They married and together began planning their lives around mountaineering. Every expedition, every training session became part of their shared goal. They knew that Everest was a peak not everyone could conquer, especially without supplementary oxygen. But it was precisely this aspect that attracted them the most. It was a challenge they wanted to accept, despite all the risks. In 1998, after years of preparation, they decided that the time had come to fulfill their dream. The Everest expedition was to be the culmination of their mountaineering careers. They knew it would not be easy, that every step would require maximum concentration and willpower. But they were confident in themselves and in each other. This confidence and love for the mountains set them on a path that was to be their last and most important journey. Once the decision was made, Sergei and Francis began meticulous preparations for the expedition. Fully aware that Everest does not forgive mistakes, they spent days, weeks, and months in training, honing the skills and endurance necessary to conquer the world's highest peak. Each of them was an experienced climber, but Everest represented a unique challenge that required the utmost caution. The preparation included not only physical training, but also mental conditioning. They knew that above 8,000 meters, they would enter the death zone, where the air is so thin that the body begins to die without supplementary oxygen. Sergei and Francis had decided to climb Everest without oxygen tanks, which made the task several times more difficult. They understood that any deviation from the plan could lead to catastrophic consequences, so every step was carefully thought out and practiced. They studied routes, read reports from previous expeditions, and analyzed the mistakes and successes of those who had gone before them. Special attention was given to the choice of equipment: lightweight but warm suits, reliable boots, ice tools. Everything had to meet the highest standards because on Everest, there are no small details. They also spent time on other peaks, acclimatizing to high altitudes so that their bodies would be ready for the conditions they would face on the way to the summit. But it wasn't just physical preparation that mattered. Sergei and Francis understood that their relationship would also be tested on Everest. They trained together, faced difficulties together, and learned to support each other in the most extreme conditions. This was especially important because, at such heights, mental state plays as crucial a role as physical strength. They had to become a unified team where each could rely on the other at any moment. When everything was ready and there was nothing left to improve or refine, Sergei and Francis set off for Nepal. Ahead of them was not just a physical challenge, but a test of the strength of their dream, their love for the mountains, and for each other. They knew that what lay ahead was not just a climb, but the hardest trial of their lives. But they were ready, or at least they believed they were. When Sergei and Francis arrived at Everest Base Camp, they were surrounded by an indescribable atmosphere of anticipation and tension. Hundreds of climbers from different countries around the world had gathered there, with one goal: to conquer the summit of the world. There was a spirit of adventure in the air, but behind it lay fear and concern about what could happen in this harsh and unpredictable environment. The base camp became their home for the next few weeks. Located at an altitude of about 5,300 meters above sea level, it was already a test for the body. Here, the acclimatization process began, which was an important part of the preparation for the climb. Every day they trained and made sorties to higher altitudes to get their bodies used to the decreasing oxygen levels. During this time, they also interacted with other climbers, sharing experiences and listening to stories from past expeditions. Many of these tales were cautionary and instilled a sense of awe. Everest was unforgiving to those who underestimated it. Soon, the step-by-step work on the ascent began. They started their climb to Camp I, located at an altitude of about 6,100 meters. This section of the route passed through the Khumbu Icefall, one of the most dangerous parts of the entire journey. Huge ice blocks, crevasses, and unstable glaciers made this crossing extremely risky. Sergei and Francis knew that every step here could be their last, but they moved forward with full concentration. Having reached camp, they returned to base camp for rest and acclimatization. Then came the path to Camp I, located at an altitude of about 6,500 meters. Here, they encountered even thinner air, but their bodies had already begun to adapt. Each day brought new challenges and difficulties. The wind grew stronger, the temperature dropped, and the air became increasingly rarefied. But despite all this, Sergei and Francis maintained their fighting spirit. They supported each other, shared thoughts, laughed, and even in such harsh conditions found joy in small things. Their belief in success remained unshakable. By the time they reached camp, the physical and mental tension had reached its peak. They knew that the most difficult challenge lay ahead, the ascent to the summit. But despite their fatigue, they were ready to continue the fight. Sergei and Francis stood on the threshold of their dream, and neither of them intended to turn back. Camp, located at about 8,000 meters, became the final point before the decisive summit attack. This point, known as the South Col, was in the so-called death zone, where oxygen levels were so low that the human body began to gradually deteriorate. In such conditions, every step required enormous effort, and even the smallest mistake could be fatal. Upon reaching camp, Sergei and Francis understood that they were facing one of the most difficult decisions of their lives. The weather was unstable and the forecasts were not promising. The wind was strengthening and the temperature was dropping to extreme lows. Despite this, their determination remained unshaken. Both understood the risks were great, but they were prepared to go all the way. Preparation for the summit push began with calculations. They studied meteorological data and tried to predict when the best window for the ascent would be. Time was against them, but they were resolute. This summit attempt was to be the culmination of their years of preparation and dedication. They knew that even a slight delay at this altitude could be fatal. Their bodies were already under tremendous pressure, and acclimatization could only provide temporary relief. In camp, the air was so thin that every breath became a struggle for survival. But despite this, Sergei and Francis were ready to take the final step toward their dream. That night, they barely slept, their minds focused on the upcoming ascent. They knew that in the morning, they would have to make the crucial decision, to climb to the summit or turn back. Understanding all the risks, they agreed to act together to support each other in any situation and not to lose hope. In the morning, with the first rays of the sun, they decided to move forward despite all the difficulties. This decision became a turning point in their fate. Sergei and Francis were full of determination and faith in their abilities. They understood that the greatest trials awaited them, but nothing could stop them in their quest to reach their goal. At dawn on May 20, 1998, Sergei and Francis Arsentiev left camp heading for the summit of Everest. They were among the few climbers who had chosen to summit without using oxygen tanks, which significantly increased the difficulty. At this altitude, oxygen levels are only about 1/3 of what they are at sea level, and every movement becomes an immense physical effort. The path to the summit passed through the south summit and then along a narrow ridge to the final goal, the highest point on Earth. With each step, they felt increasing weakness. The air was becoming even thinner, and their bodies struggled to adapt to these extreme conditions. Francis, particularly sensitive to oxygen deprivation, began to show the first signs of hypoxia. Sergei, aware of the seriousness of the situation, tried to support her both morally and physically. They moved slowly but steadily, despite worsening weather conditions. The wind was picking up, and the sky was clouding over, creating additional threats. In such moments, it was crucial to maintain concentration and avoid mistakes that could lead to tragedy. However, as they progressed, it became evident that their strength was waning. Only a few hundred meters remained to the summit, but each step was becoming increasingly difficult. Francis began to show signs of disorientation, which worried Sergei. They stopped to discuss the situation. At that moment, it became clear that continuing the ascent could be life-threatening. Making the decision to turn back is one of the hardest things for a climber, especially when the goal is so close. Despite all their efforts, Sergei and Francis were forced to accept the harsh reality. Their bodies were not capable of continuing the ascent without serious risk to their lives. They decided to begin the descent, hoping to return to camp before nightfall. But at these heights, every step back was just as dangerous as the path forward. In the conditions of strong wind and falling temperatures, they began the descent. But it soon became clear that they had separated from each other in the darkness and the snowstorm. This was the moment when events began to spiral out of their control, and the struggle shifted from conquering the summit to surviving. When it became clear that they had lost each other, anxiety and fear began to mount. In the death zone, at an altitude of over 8,000 meters, even a slight loss of time can prove fatal. Sergei and Francis found themselves separated on a dangerous section of the slope, marking the beginning of a series of tragic events that they could no longer control. Francis was left alone, surrounded by icy cold and impenetrable darkness. Her condition rapidly deteriorated. Hypoxia was intensifying her disorientation and weakness. She tried to keep moving, but every step was an immense struggle. Soon, her strength began to wane, and she found herself in a position where continuing became impossible. Meanwhile, Sergei, realizing that Francis was no longer with him, began to search for her, retracing his steps. He knew they had little time but couldn't leave her in such a state. Sergei was aware that the situation was critical, but he wasn't ready to give up. He continued searching despite worsening weather conditions and his own exhaustion. Francis was found by other climbers the next day, May 21, at dawn. She was sitting in the snow on the slope, semi-conscious and weak. Her condition was critical, and several climbers tried to assist her. They shared their oxygen tanks with her, gave her water, and tried to warm her. However, moving her down was impossible. They didn't have the necessary equipment, and their own strength was nearly depleted. Francis remained on the slope, waiting for a miracle that never came. Meanwhile, Sergei continued searching for his wife, unaware that she had already been found, but saving her was impossible. Soon he, too, found himself in a desperate situation. His body was later discovered nearby, and like his wife, he fell victim to the harsh conditions of Everest. The day after Francis was found by other climbers, efforts to organize a rescue operation began. However, at an altitude of over 8,000 meters, such actions are extremely difficult and dangerous. In the thin air and harsh weather, climbers face limitations that make rescue operations nearly impossible. Despite this, several teams attempted to take steps to help Francis. Each of them understood that descending from such an altitude alone is almost impossible for a weakened climber. Finding herself in a situation where her life depended on external help, Francis continued to fight for survival. But as time passed, her strength ebbed away. At an altitude where every breath is a struggle, even simple waiting became torture. Other climbers in the vicinity were also on the edge of their capabilities. They knew that any attempt at evacuation could put their own lives at risk. Decisions were made under extreme stress, where every minute could be decisive. In the end, after several hours of trying to help, they were forced to leave Francis on the slope, realizing that there was nothing more they could do. Meanwhile, Sergei, despairing of finding his wife, was forced to return to camp. He was himself on the verge of exhaustion and understood that his own life was now in danger. In the mountains, where every step can be your last, Sergei faced the terrifying reality. His wife might not survive, and he might not make it either. His final hours on the slope were filled with hopelessness and despair. He did everything he could to find and save Francis, but time and strength were against him. Soon after he was found on the slope, it became clear that he, too, had fallen victim to the harsh conditions of Everest. This marked the end of their journey together and the beginning of a story that would forever remain in the memory of mountaineers. Sergei Arsentiev fought to the very end. When it became clear that he would not be able to find and save Francis, he continued to fight for his own life. But in conditions where even the simplest actions require incredible effort, his chances of survival decreased with each passing minute. Sergei decided to descend from the summit, understanding that his only chance of survival was to return to camp. But his strength was already waning, and each step became increasingly difficult. He tried to follow the route down, but soon became disoriented and lost his way. His body was later found lying on the slope, on the same route they had taken to climb to the summit. Sergei, like Francis, fell victim to the harsh conditions of Everest. He was unable to return to the camp and perished while trying to save himself and his wife. Their dream of conquering the summit turned into a tragedy that shook the entire mountaineering world. The deaths of Sergei and Francis Arsentiev served as a brutal reminder of how dangerous mountaineering can be, especially at such heights. Both were experienced climbers, but even their knowledge and preparation couldn't protect them from the dangers of Everest. This bitter lesson became part of a story that would live on in the memory of mountaineers for a long time. Despite their tragic fate, Sergei and Francis left behind a legacy of courage and determination. Their story became a symbol of how far people are willing to go in their pursuit of a dream, even when it turns out to be deadly. The ascent that was supposed to be their triumph turned into a tragedy, but their memory will live on in the hearts of those who share their passion for the mountains. A few days after the tragic events, the bodies of Sergei and Francis were discovered by other climbers. Francis lay on the slope, wrapped in her white suit, motionless and almost untouched by time. Her body became a grim reminder of how dangerous Everest can be. She was found in a position as if she were peacefully sleeping, and this sight deeply affected many climbers who passed by. Francis became known as the Sleeping Beauty, and her story became one of the most famous tragedies on Everest. However, the fact that her body remained visible to all climbers ascending the mountain caused not only sadness, but also concern among the mountaineers. Some of them decided to move her body to a more secluded place to reduce the psychological burden on others making the ascent. In 2007, nearly 9 years after the tragedy, a team of climbers led by Dennis O'Brien organized an operation to relocate Francis Arsentiev's body. They carefully and respectfully moved her to a more sheltered spot on the slope so that she could rest in peace. This act was motivated not only by human kindness, but also by a desire to honor her memory, ensuring that her fate would not become just a grim reminder of the risks of mountaineering. Sergei was found nearby, but his body remained in place, a silent witness to his desperate attempt to save his wife. Their story has been told many times, and each time it evokes mixed emotions in people: admiration for their courage and deep sadness over the tragic end of their dream. This tragedy demonstrated how fragile life can be at such heights, where humans face the harshest forces of nature. But it also reminded us that even in the most extreme conditions, people remain loyal to their loved ones, willing to go to the very end, trying to save each other, even if the chances of success are almost non-existent. The story of Sergei and Francis Arsentiev continues to live on in the hearts of climbers as a symbol of courage and selflessness. Their tragic fate on Everest serves as a lesson for all who dare to ascend this peak. It reminds us of the importance of not only preparing physically and mentally, but also understanding the limits of our abilities, acknowledging that even the most experienced climbers can face insurmountable challenges. Memorials have been erected in memory of Sergei and Francis, and their names are forever inscribed in the history of mountaineering. Their example serves as a reminder that the mountains demand respect and caution, and that no summit is worth a life. But despite this, their dream of conquering Everest continues to inspire new climbers who follow in their footsteps, striving to overcome themselves and reach the world's highest peak. Sergei and Francis Arsentiev will remain in history as a couple who loved each other and the mountains, who were ready to face the greatest challenges for the sake of their dream. Their story will live on in the hearts of those who, despite all the risks, cannot abandon their passion for climbing, even when this passion leads to tragic consequences. Their deaths on the slopes of Everest have become part of the great and tragic history of mountaineering, where the joy of victory is often accompanied by the bitterness of loss. This story reminds us that even the greatest dreams can be dangerous, and that the path to the summit is not only a physical ascent, but also a spiritual test that not everyone can pass.